Welcome to Holteras Presents, a brand-agnostic interview podcast that seeks to objectively highlight the happenings within the world of diagnostics. And now, your hosts, Rich Thayer and Mickey Yode.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of Holteras Presents. My name is Rich Thayer, Managing Partner at Holteras Associates.
And this is Mickey Yode, Founding Partner at Holteras Associates. Many of you may be aware of the Rapid Acceleration for Diagnostics program that was initiated by the NIH in 2020 in response to the need for new diagnostics in the pandemic. And it is a remarkable program that's still ongoing today, where they put in place a number of processes that helped companies develop in a very rapid fashion new diagnostics and get them on the market. And our guest today, Nancy Gagliano, is one of the very first people involved in that program and has been critical in it all through this time. And she has the insider's view in how that all has worked, what the impact has been, and how well the country was able to respond as a result of developing that program.
Yes, Mickey, it's a fascinating program and a wonderful example of the power of government involvement. You know, they got more than 3,000 inquiries into the RADx program, and were able to, in real time, put in place a process that let them deeply evaluate going on 200 of them, and in fact, fund 50 companies that went on to make submissions to FDA under the EUA process, a phenomenal success. In fact, Holteras was able to work with 10 of those RADx-funded companies and came away very impressed, seeing firsthand the amount of support and structure that went into helping guide those companies and bringing those technologies through the process. And now, here is our interview with Nancy Gagliano.
Hello, Nancy, and welcome to the podcast. We're very happy to have you here today. Please give our audience a bit of background on yourself.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here. I'm Nancy Gagliano. I'm a physician. I'm an internist by training. Spent about 21 years at Massachusetts General Hospital as a primary care provider, and then ultimately a senior vice president of practice improvement, always focused on improving operations, making it easier to provide excellent health care. And then I went to CVS Health, where I was the chief medical officer for Minute Clinic, and there became very, very interested in streamlining healthcare, bringing healthcare out into the community. And one of the things that we did a lot of was point of care testing. At that point, I became involved in a group called the Point of Care Testing Research Network. And then after that, did a little consulting. COVID hit, and I received this magical phone call one day. Could I help with RADx Tech?
That's very interesting. Very, very interesting. The speed of the innovation in the diagnostic industry during this pandemic is probably unparalleled in all history. The only thing we can think of that is even close to it is the AIDS epidemic, but that's a distant second. So did the size, breadth, and quality of the response surprise you in any way?
Well, certainly the size, breadth, and the speed surprised me greatly. I completely agree. There was nothing ever like this before. I was a medical student during the beginning phases of the AIDS epidemic, and we did a lot of scratching our heads, and people were trying to figure out what was going on. But this was completely different. I do have to say, however, this was one of those things. I remember the phone call I received. I received a phone call and was asked, would I be willing to work on COVID-19, developing diagnostic tests in this project called RADx Tech? How could I say no? How could anybody say no? We had so many people that we were able to tap into, companies we were able to tap into. Everybody jumped on board. There was not a hesitation. It definitely helped that there was a lot of money behind it. But in addition to the money, there was a lot of people with a lot of different expertise. that came to the table, and that truly made the difference. It wasn't just about money and companies. It was a lot of people coming together to make this work.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, can you tell us a bit more about that thinking behind RADx, and how did it come about so quickly? And what were the models that were looked at to learn from? For instance,
Sure.
DARPA, you already
Yeah,
mentioned POCTURN, and then
right.
Shark Tank even.
Shark
And
Tank.
it's
You heard about
amazing.
Shark Tank.
Yeah.
Um, to my understanding, Senators Lamar Alexander and Roy Blunt had a conversation with Francis Collins, who was the head of the NIH at that point. And they said, how can we do this quickly? How can we get diagnostic tests out quickly? Could we do something like a Shark Tank? And that was the initial idea. And essentially, the way it evolved was the Shark Tank concept was to cast a wide net, um, get the word out there that we were interested in any and all companies that might be able to produce COVID diagnostic tests quickly. In the beginning, it was everything from point of care, home tests, molecular tests, lab tests. Could we get companies interested? Uh, we had over 800 companies within just a few weeks submit applications. The concept of the Shark Tank was then to do what we called an innovation funnel. Take all of these companies, have really smart people look at their applications and whittle it down to a manageable number. And I'm talking a big manageable number, like in the 300s of companies that actually had promise. The next phase was to take those companies, and then we did something called a deep dive. We had teams of experts work with the companies for a couple of weeks. I called it looked under the hood. Okay, on the application, they said they could make this fancy test in 3 months, but was there something there? We used to kid that sometimes there were, two guys in a garage and a dog trying to come up with a test. But we had companies that were small. We had academic organizations. We had big, huge companies that already did diagnostics. They went through the deep dive funnel with the concept of could we get tests on the market within about 6 months? From there, a smaller number met the next stage gate. And then from there, smaller number met the next stage gate. But I just think it's extraordinary that about a year later, we had 44 companies have their EUAs, emergency use authorizations for COVID tests. Extraordinary number. I would say another thing that was most people are probably not aware of. Yes, there was a lot of money. We're talking over $1.2 billion. Much of the money went to the companies to actually produce the tests, to do what they needed to produce the test. But what was so unique, and this is something that I really, really hope continues with NIH and offerings like this in the future, is the what we call the in-kind support. We had so much infrastructure there to help the companies. We worked incredibly closely with the FDA. I had the opportunity to lead a weekly meeting with the FDA officials to talk about what were the rules, what were they seeing, what were they worried about, so we could give guidance to our companies so that they could develop a product that was more likely to receive an EUA. We met with generals on supply chains. I remember the early phone calls about talking about having planes flown in from Italy for cotton swabs. I don't know if you remember those days. In the
Yes.
beginning, there weren't the
OPAN.
nasal swabs, and we were talking about getting cotton swabs to our companies so that they could test the product, and nitrocellulose, all sorts of different reagents that the companies needed. We had experts in regulatory. We had experts in quality. We had experts in human factors so that the test could be built in a way that we could make sure that people could use the tests. So I definitely heard a lot of positive feedback from the companies that yes, the money was vital, but the expertise was really extraordinary. And I have to say, a number of really, really talented people either came out of retirement, came out of consulting, you know, gave up their day jobs to do this, which was probably a little less lucrative than they were used to, but everybody was 100% committed to do this and to do this successfully. It was extraordinary.
Truly.
I can't help but contrast that to the early 2000s with the West Nile outbreak and FDA coming, instead of how RADx unfolded, FDA going directly to, at the time, Chiron and to Roche, where I was running the blood screening business, and pleading, could you guys please develop a blood screening test for West Nile? And both companies stepping up and self-funding development of that test, then FDA releasing under IND for national blood screening. So two companies, only two shots on goal, and
Right.
how might that have changed had there been more of this RADx approach to a very fast opening? Hey, we need some new technologies. Again, just
Right.
as an aside, but what a change in
Right.
not that many
Right.
years.
So, and one of the things that I think was remarkable about this is really how the NIH stepped up and looked at it. If you know the NIH, they historically are very much a research organization. Their prior way of looking at things was to see a need, provide a grant, come back in a year. How'd you do? Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. Give a lot of autonomy to the awardees, and really tended to focus on companies that were or academic organizations. I think what was really different here is that the FDA and the NIH and a number of the other organizations um, work together in a way that they hadn't worked together before. And the NIH, one of the conversations I've had a number of times with NIH leadership was how striking they found that by having stage gates, by setting milestones, by working closely, by providing the expertise, how much better and how much faster they could get things done. So I think that yes, there'll be NIH grants, but I think we're already seeing that they're using this model much more so and trying to incorporate this into more of a day-to-day operations because of the success, because of the speed, the cost efficiency, lots of reasons.
Nancy, Halteris had the opportunity to work with several of the RADx grantees, and we were astonished and amazed with how these grantees embraced this opportunity and the necessity contributed and put in, 24/7 efforts, frankly, as did the entire RADx team itself. As mentioned already, this, reminds us of the extraordinary efforts during the AIDS epidemic, but on steroids now. What do you see as the greatest contributions of the RADx program and what its legacy is likely to be?
So yeah, along that line, I think you really are spot on that it was not only the companies that were working 24/7, but it was also the RADx team. We have over 300 people on the RADx team. Let's just say we had some pretty robust timelines. So the companies were told they needed to provide this data by this time, and we were looking at them all the time. We had program facilitators and team leads who were working side by side. So I think I don't anticipate that the 24/7 efforts are going to continue in the future. That was quite extraordinary. We used to kid that we were kind of building the plane as we were flying it, because we were figuring things out all along the way, and a company would call and say, we need a contract research organization, and 2 days later we had a contract with them. So the intensity and the speed, I don't think will be quite the legacy. But I do think there's a number of things. Number one is the NIH had historically worked with academic organizations, and I definitely see them working with all sorts of companies, startups, well-established companies. There's lots of opportunities. And I'll just take a little tangent and talk briefly about a project that I'm working on,
Please.
a RADx type project. It's called the Maternal Health Challenge, but same concept, same concept. In this country, we have a problem with maternal mortality. Of all the industrialized nations, we have the highest maternal mortality. A lot of it, unfortunately, is based in lower socioeconomic groups and what we call healthcare deserts. Doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be in the middle of nowhere. We have healthcare deserts in cities where there's certain areas that women don't have access to healthcare. So we're in the middle of a challenge, sent out an RFP for solicitations for solutions, technologic solutions that might help monitor patients and catch conditions earlier. And we're doing the same process. Start with the funnel, reviewing them, take the next wave that we think are the best, doing a deep dive to see if there's what's really under the covers. And all along the way, these companies are going to, every time they pass a certain hurdle, are getting prize money. Hopefully that'll help keep their engine going. And I think it has helped to encourage companies that may not have otherwise come to think about maternal health problem. I think there's some companies that just, it's not necessarily the money, because these challenges, we're talking $750,000. Now, we're not talking millions. But these companies getting recognition by the NIH and winning a challenge is beneficial to the companies. So I think that you're going to see many more opportunities like this. I think. So that's the companies, the challenge, the technology, how the NIH might be working in the future. But from a healthcare perspective, I think there's a huge new opportunity. I think the biggest piece of COVID that we learned was decentralizing healthcare can make a big difference. What I mean by decentralizing is you don't go to your doctor's office to get your COVID test. You go to the pharmacy. You go to a bus. You go to a stand. You go to a garage. You then buy the test at home. The government sends you the test. So all of a sudden, things that only happened in clinical settings, we transitioned across the country. That breaks open a barrier that is a huge barrier. We learned a lot of lessons. One of the aspects that I was overseeing was what we call the deployment and the education and the disbursement of these tests. What we learned is if we build it, it doesn't mean they will come. Mm-hmm. It was complicated. First of all, pharmacies weren't set up to do testing. They had to figure that out. We needed all of this infrastructure. The education around testing was very complicated. Unfortunately, I believe that the myriad of press out there did not do us a service. the complexity of sensitivity and specificity, it's a complicated concept. I mean, I still don't like statistics that much. I barely have that understanding. And that was all translated in the media to the tests are bad. It was very, very frustrating. And I tried to use the analogy of I think everybody either has had a rapid strep or they've known somebody who's had a rapid strep. And the doc says, sometimes they're not right. And we use our clinical judgment to determine what the next steps are. So medicine has always had good tests and higher sensitive tests and lower specificity tests. And we've had that, but we didn't do a good job educating the public about the nuances. And therefore, the whole wave of media really got onto the bandwagon that these tests are bad because they're not perfect. So I think we still have a significant opportunity in that way to kind of go the next wave, to keep this concept of decentralized healthcare out there, testing out there, but the education part of it, I think, was underestimated.
Yeah. If I might digress a little bit, I remember a conversation you and I had 2 years ago with one of the ASU diagnostic conferences, and we were talking about home testing in particular. And you said one of the biggest problems that we have is that physicians don't believe the results. And what's the first thing they do? They go
Repeat the
order a
test.
laboratory test.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Are we making progress on that front with these educational processes?
I think that's a really good question. I think for some tests, for certain concepts, the physicians are going to repeat the tests. But the sad truth is the physicians didn't want these patients in their offices. And today, you can call a physician and say, I did a home COVID test and it's positive. I think I might need Paxlovid, or do I need Paxlovid, or whatever. And the physician is more than happy to treat you over the phone. So I think we have made some progress in that. And I think that's part of the concept where we've moved the needle with decentralized healthcare. I think we've also moved the needle with telehealth. Telehealth was, for 20 years now, we've been talking about telehealth being like next year is going to be the big year. Next year is going to be the big year. And then all of a sudden, all of those barriers and those reasons not to do telehealth went to the wayside. I think doctors got more comfortable with telehealth. Patients got more comfortable with telehealth. And I think that there's much more of an appetite to continue that. And some specialties, telehealth doesn't work very well. I'm not saying that everything should be telehealth, but I think a much more blended approach would be helpful. But I do think we still have a number of barriers. For example, the government gave Paxlovid to a lot of pharmacies. Paxlovid is free, given to pharmacies, but pharmacies don't have the infrastructure to assess patients, to document if they need the Paxlovid, to do the test, and to actually have any sort of reimbursement for providing this service. So while I see us moving more toward pharmacies providing more healthcare, particularly in diagnostic types of arenas, I think that there needs to be a lot more work in figuring out how to create the workflow, the reimbursement models, and the pharmacy engagement to really keep pushing healthcare out into new areas.
Yeah, we concur. Nancy, a couple of years ago, Halteris had the opportunity to do an assessment and a publication on why diagnostic companies fail. And one of the common tenets that we came or discovered is that there tends to be a strong underestimation of the amount of effort that is needed in the regulatory process and how long, how much money it will take. And for us, it was very welcome and extraordinary the efforts RADx went to not only include regulatory and regulatory requirements as part of this whole effort, but to make the introductions to FDA and to work with FDA on what data sets need to be prepared, et cetera. Can you talk a bit more about how that came to be?
That was one of the things that was very obvious within weeks, that while the FDA was going to have an EUA process, it was a bit of a black box, and we could not help our companies get their EUA if we didn't know what the thresholds were going to be. Thankfully, the FDA at the most senior level realized that the RADx program was extremely important. And literally for 2 years, I'm talking about the 2 years that I was the FDA liaison, we met every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, and there were at least 7 to 10 people from the FDA on that meeting. We did not have the companies in that meeting. We wanted to create a little bit of distance and make sure that we were above board and didn't put the FDA in an awkward position with a company making demands or fighting their battle. So we had our RADx folks be the intermediaries. But every week we went over, okay, you came up with this, we need 30 positives. Fine. We need 30 negatives. We need 30 negatives, and we can't find the 30 negatives. So, and the infection was waxing and waning, and they would start with a requirement for a certain sensitivity and specificity, and then the companies, particularly the point of care over the counter antigens, are having trouble meeting it. So we had some conversations about, is this the right threshold? We also had really novel ideas. We were talking about breath tests. Well, there'd been no diagnostic breath test for an infectious agent. How do you even think about VOCs, volatile chemicals? So we had separate meetings to brainstorm with the FDA about, okay, how do we even think about what would be the requirements? So I found the FDA rigorous, but truly delightful to work with. They wanted to be a good partner.
Yeah, I mean, we've had many interactions with the FDA before RADx, and I always have found them to be truly helpful. They want to help you do the right thing. You just got to not think of them as the enemy, but as
Exactly.
helpful partners.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they had, everybody was busy, and they not only had the RADx companies, but they had lots and lots of other companies that they were trying to support. So I know they were working 24/7, just like everybody else, to try to meet the needs.
You were talking about samples, and I was thinking about the impact that Emory and University of Massachusetts have had and the NIH relationship with them. Can you speak a
Yeah,
little bit about that?
sure. So one of the great things about POCTERN, point of care testing research network, is we already had a group of academic organizations that had collaborated previously. Emory, UMass, Johns Hopkins, Harvard. So there were a number of organizations that were already in the point of care space and had a fair amount of expertise and infrastructure. So, for example, one group was really, really good at human factors, and every single test that made it to a certain threshold, we had them evaluate to be able to determine if this could actually be used by an average person. We had, at Emory and a couple of other organizations, they had testing sites. So we could do two things. One is from a scientific technology perspective, take the equipment and replicate it in their lab with different people to verify that the statistics that they generated, the quality that they were reporting was actually true. And then we had places where we could have the test performed on symptomatic patients or sometimes asymptomatic patients. So we were able to really try hard to provide all the different pieces that a company would need that could take them typically years to do themselves. One of the nice things is because we had our own infrastructure to be able to validate the results, the FDA became much more comfortable with the results that were reported to them, because then we said, okay, this is what the company said. This is what our validation said. And then the FDA felt that, okay, I trust this group because they've been doing this and doing this and doing this. So I think the relationship with the FDA and the validation only became stronger and stronger once the FDA realized that we could help shorten the timeline by doing the validation for them.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. This is a great insider's background on the RADx program. So what's next for RADx?
So as I said, there's lots of different projects going on. So in the COVID space, there's two continued projects. One project is to essentially try to find the best of the best, right? So yes, the sensitivity and the specificity in some of the tests are a little bit disappointing. And so there is a project going on to try to amp up the performance and look at those those companies that already have EUAs and which companies maybe we can get a higher level of performance out of and give them a little bit more of a gold star. Another test, and this goes in the lessons learned, another project under RADx is the accessibility project. So, I mean, we thought it was bad enough to do the brain tickle in the beginning, right? And I think we were all happy when it moved to the anterior nares. Well, imagine you have arthritis and you can't hold something that's a Q-tip or the size of a pen. How do you do a COVID test? Imagine you have low vision. I'm sure you've all seen what's called the IFU, those instruction sheets that are written. You need a magnifying lens. They got everything that was required by the FDA on that one sheet. Um, so, so there's a project going on that is looking at some of the companies and trying to find the ones that are most accessible for those with disabilities and perhaps tweak them to make them even more accessible.
We have an appreciation for that. We did a lot of work for the Gates Foundation on HIV self-tests and IFU design, and then testing in populations in South Africa. And boy, were there lessons learned. Sometimes we thought that IFU was designed just beautifully, and we saw people do things we never would have guessed, like
Right.
drink the buffer,
Right.
or
Right.
incredible things. So
Right.
it's
Right.
a real science.
No, and that is why also working with the FDA is so important, because we definitely heard of the tests that required you to take a dropper and drop into that round little hole, if you could ever find that round little hole. But because it was droppers, some people put them in their eyes. And therefore, the FDA was very, very stringent about making sure that solution could be drunk, could be put in your eye, and wouldn't be harmful. And that a company is just looking for a reagent that's going to work, not necessarily thinking about those nuances. Let's see, there's a couple of other projects going on. There is an HIV RADx project going on. There's a RADx-like project that's going on in neurology. So, and as I mentioned, my project that I'm working with is the maternal mortality. So I think this is just the beginning. I think that we're going to be seeing many similar type projects coming out. The funding is going to be a little bit different. Hopefully, I think the model is great. Get a broader group, but have thresholds, have stage gates, be much closer to the company that's receiving the grants, provide them with some expertise. And I think the government will be using their dollars much more wisely if RADx-like projects can be supported more so.
Great. So the RADx program has been an incredible catalyst to get a lot of companies over the hump and into the marketplace, get them to the point where they can manufacture, but there's a lot more necessary in order for them to be successful and sustain their delivery. So how do you think about that in terms of where RADx stops and what else happens? Is it going to be now private sector take over, or is there more that NIH RADx is going to be doing to help make sure that these things are available long term?
Yeah, no, I think that's a tough question. Certainly, the capacity that was built is significantly more than is needed right now. And not only NIH, other arms of the government supported the COVID testing through different grants, the school program, the stockpiling program, a number of companies were given large grants to build the manufacturing infrastructure. I think in general, Congress and others want to make sure that somehow we have that capacity within our infrastructure. But how to maintain that capacity, I think, is very challenging. Companies can't produce hundreds of thousands and millions of tests if there is no market. Companies have already been having to shutter some of their manufacturing. I don't think the government is really in the position of keeping all of these companies afloat.
Right.
So I think that, the answer is, and I know we've worked with companies and the government's been involved in trying to understand, is there a way that we can scale way back, but be poised if there's another outbreak or if there's a new virus, so that we're not quite starting from scratch. And I don't think that is, it's the pandemic preparedness. I don't think that's an easy problem to solve. I certainly think that there's opportunity now to advance point of care testing. And I think that over the next few years, there'll be more point of care tests. And I'm sure you've been hearing about flu and RSV and STDs. And I do think the field of point of care testing will continue to grow. And hopefully a handful of the companies that have very robust manufacturing capabilities will be able to supplement their manufacturing line with other tests, so that we're not mothballing everything. I think that the government has done what they can with stockpiling, but I don't think the government can continue just to write blank checks for all of these companies. I think some of the companies are not going to make it, but hopefully a number of the companies have been given enough of a jump start that they now have a good platform to continue to grow with.
Yeah. It's like the fish are now able to walk on land, and now they have to find the niches where they can evolve into something sustainable. That's
Exactly.
natural
Exactly.
selection.
Right. And we, I think we don't want it to be a complete capitalistic market where because COVID goes away that all of these companies can't survive. I think there is this will that hopefully we can keep a number of them um, going as well as they can keep themselves going so that we're not losing all of this capacity, but it's
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue actually to our next question, and that has to do with the RADx grantees that develop new platforms, technologies that have been being incubated for several years and now have the opportunity to be, jump started for you getting to market. And these platforms certainly can do much more than respiratory testing, and
right.
other areas, STIs, et cetera. In fact, you mentioned some emerging opportunities in telemedicine and over the counter, the efforts through CVS and others. How do you see menu expansion and new contributions to improve healthcare playing out?
Yeah, so it's pretty exciting. Well, I have to tell you that before 2 years ago, I thought CRISPR was an oven tool to make, you know, potato chips crispier. So I learned a lot of science that I'm probably going to completely forget, but there's some really cool technologies out there. And, some of the diagnostic companies have very sophisticated handheld tools, handheld diagnostics that can be used in all sorts of settings. And, we think of, one setting is the telehealth setting, but, United States and the world is very, very large. And having technologies such as I mentioned, the whole concept of breath tests. Could this country actually get to the point that in a big stadium you could test people as they're walking through? Can we get to the point that on a fishing vessel they could have a wide variety of waterproof, motion proof, very high sensitive diagnostics? So I think that, as I said earlier, I think we have broken open the concept that diagnostics can indeed move out into uh, other formats and other places. And it's our job to keep pushing the envelope such that healthcare access can be greater. Certainly, the STD field, that's a field where there's lots of concerns about privacy, and there's been a very strong demand and interest out there that if we could make STD testing much more accessible um, in the United States and internationally, that would be dramatic. So I think that a lot of these platforms have tremendous opportunity to be leveraged for other diseases and other locations. I think one of the frustrations for all of us is we loved the EUA process that actually allowed a test to get out on the market in a few months. All of these other things are going back to the 510K process, which is not a 3 to 6 month process, but more in the terms of at least a year or so, and very expensive because the number of people that the diagnostic test has to be performed on to get the 510 qualification is just very, very high. So While I'm optimistic that the technology is poised and ready and the demand is potentially out there, I think we're all going to be a little bit frustrated that the next 2 years we're not seeing an incredible wave of new diagnostics. The other thing that I think has also hit home a little bit is in the moving to point of care, there's been a clearer differentiation of there's different levels of point of care, right? So there's the point of care that is CLIA based, meaning you need a lab license. That's the point of care that you get in an urgent care, that you get in your doctor's office, that you might get at a minute clinic. And the test is approved to be performed by somebody who has the right kind of license. Then there's prescription over the counter, which is something somewhat new concept where you need a doctor's note to get the test and to run the test. And in many cases, I think that makes sense because we would want to make sure that there is a clinician helping to interpret the results of the test. And then there's truly the over-the-counter, which you can go in, you don't need guidance, you can purchase it, the pregnancy test concept, the now COVID concept, where you can get the test, perform the test, and then be responsible for the result and decide what you want to do with the results. So I think those three areas are going to continue to evolve. And I think the average person may be hopeful that there'll be more and more over-the-counter tests, but I think that's going to be a little bit more slow to come forward without a pandemic really pushing having tests without clinicians involved.
Nancy, thanks so much. Can you tell us a little bit about the process that NIH went through to get to this mechanism of interacting with the companies and vetting options? Were there other programs you looked to, or was it just like you said, in building an airplane while you're flying it?
Well,
what was the approach?
Yeah, I honestly think it truly was building the airplane while we were flying it. There was when I joined probably 6 weeks after RADx had started, I remember going to a meeting with Francis Collins and Bruce Tromberg early on when they were starting to talk about this idea. And it is my fault that I actually asked a question and had an opinion, and that was it's like, oh, let's get Nancy involved. Because I asked a question about national distribution and and manufacturing, and there were a lot of academics in the audience who had not been in a company that had a national exposure like CVS, and I understood a little bit of logistics, and they said, "Oh, we need somebody who has any idea what national logistics might look like from the NIH." So it was really a matter in the early days of people calling people who might have experience in chemistry, in manufacturing, in medical devices, in diagnostics, people who had big Rolodexes, who knew the people in the organization. We all came together and tried to define and design a process. We had one person, Paul Tessier, who had to have the process and had to have all the flow sheets of this process, which was masterful so that we could reproduce it. But it really was, okay, we're going to send out this solicitation. How are we going to weed them out. Well, let's have a questionnaire. Who's going to build the questionnaire? Oh, we should put the questionnaire in the computer. Some of this was indeed built. NIH ways to actually evaluate, but it was day one. Oh, we need that form. Who's going to design that form? Oh, we need that in the computer. Who's going to put it in the computer? Who are the right people to do the initial scanning? Okay, after we, gee, we don't believe some of these. We should do this thing. We'll call it a deep dive. We'll have an expert team go in and work with the company. So it really was building and designing as we were going forward. I was leading the deployment team, and we had the general concept that we would need to create infrastructure to support the teams. We had a general concept very early on, as I said, that we needed regulatory support. Became pretty clear we needed supply chain support. Became pretty clear that we needed a quality management system that we could give to the companies. So, the team that was working with me, hey, Brian, we need this today. He'd come back, okay, give me 2 days. I'll get you. I'll get it. And we didn't know what we needed until we were in it. So the good thing is we did document, and we did have processes, and those are now very reproducible processes. And we learned some lessons. We did some tweaking. We had a process of steering committees, so a very formal committee who would review the applications. And there were about 30 people in the meetings, different experts. So we had clinicians, we had technicians, we had chemists, we had a variety of people with different manufacturing expertise. And then the teams, not the companies, the teams representing the companies would present the companies, and we'd give the thumbs up and the thumbs down. And, like, okay, we don't need to spend 45 minutes talking about a company. Maybe we could shorten this. Maybe we can narrow it. Maybe we can be a little bit more focused. So, lots of learnings along the way, but it was very energizing.
That's fascinating. It's really fascinating. So, what do you think will happen when the inevitable next major pathogen spills over into the human population? Is the NIH poised to spring on it with a new RADx program? Presumably, if you do, it's a rather different thing because you probably have already developed most of the technologies that are going to be necessary. Right. So what will be different?
What will be different? That's a great question. So, for example, there's a monkeypox RADx team. So, right? Why not? Yeah. Monkeypox is not a pandemic, but it is a new infectious disease that we want to get our hands on, and we have the infrastructure and a lot of the technology. I think we will be able to respond much more quickly. I think the turnaround will be in the order of a couple of months rather than 6 to 9 months. I think, unfortunately, unless it happens in a short while, we'll be faced with the manufacturing problem again, because we just are not going to have that capacity mothballed. But a lot has learned, so that rather than waiting until a company gets the EUA and the company starts to manufacture and realizes they need to build a manufacturing plant, maybe there is the concept of let's build some contract manufacturing right from the beginning. So it doesn't matter so much which company wins. We're ramping up our contract manufacturing. We're getting some of the companies that have the ability mothball to get going so that they're ready. I think there's some things that we will be able to speed up. I think the technology, 20 years of technology will be different again, and there'll be cool things. There were some things that we were so excited about that never worked. For example, concept of we'll put a lollipop on each kid's desk, and in the morning, and if the lollipop changes, that kid's got COVID, get out of the room. That was exciting. That one, we couldn't get that one to work, but I think there'll still be lots more opportunities for diagnostics. We did not solve large group gathering COVID testing. So we did not solve, we kind of have a clunky thing for schools, never came up with something for an auditorium, never came up with something for a restaurant, never came up with something for public buildings. So I still think there's lots of opportunities for new technologies out there.
Yeah, we've seen some exciting things recently, remote sensing devices that might be able to help out in that regard.
Right. So yeah. So I don't think we're done. I don't think we're done with innovating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nancy, we've also seen some opportunities looking at silicon-based approaches, aptamer-based approaches where you know what you're looking for, the microfluidics and chips where you can actually print tests, millions of tests all at once and not have to go through, bioreactors or go through, other ways of getting antigens, et cetera. Is there any thought to maybe set up demonstration facilities for this or have that capacity? Because that's something you could imagine, without that biology factor, without the human training factor, it could be more quickly turned off and on.
Right. Great question. I have no idea. so I am not aware of what demonstration project and other projects are underway. There has been quite a bit of conversation about kind of like the next generation. We did a little bit with aptamers, and I think that's definitely growing. So as I said, I think the technology, we did pretty well with what we had, and we got things done quickly. It will be great to see that there isn't a pause on exciting new technology development. And I definitely would anticipate, without having any inside knowledge, that is something that the NIH would like to continue to see. Advancement of innovation in this arena. Maybe not having to produce 1 million tests a day, but let's keep working on advancing the technology so that it's quicker and easier in the future.
Yeah, those are great ideas and great suggestions.
Yeah. You remind me of about a decade ago, NCI invited me out to listen to a number of people present on the work they were doing in potential new diagnostic tests. And they asked for my advice. Why aren't they becoming standard of care in the community? And there were a number of reasons why, but one of them was education. And I had a radical idea for him. I said, why doesn't the NIH come up with a sales and marketing organization to actually educate physicians for the first time with the truth about what these tests do and don't do? And, and today, the education process of changing so much. YouTube videos, right. And we were talking about IFUs a little while ago, and we've been doing a lot of work. We take paper IFUs and turn them into video IFUs, which are much easier for people to follow.
Absolutely.
So, there is an opportunity, I think, to use modern technologies to educate people in a more systematic and less costly way to really know what's going on, because it's so hard for anyone to keep up, especially primary care docs, right?
Oh my goodness, yes.
They're too busy to read this stuff.
Right. Yeah. You can't keep up with everything. And that just reemphasizes one of the core lessons learned is a lot of money was invested in the technology, but an inadequate amount of resources was invested in education. And education has never really been the purview of the NIH. It's been much more of the purview of the CDC. And I think I'm hopeful that in the future there'll be a lot more collaboration in that arena, because it was definitely an area that I don't think we did a great job as the country, and we left a lot of the education up to journalists, and there was it became sensationalized. It was much more fun for them to say the tests were bad than to try to explain sensitivity and specificity.
Yeah, very, very, very true. This has been great. We've explored a lot.
Yeah.
Good.
This has been just wonderful.
Great.
Thanks so very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Holteras Presents is produced by Holteras Associates, a US-based bioscience consultancy that provides strategic and tactical services in the areas of diagnostics, medical devices, and life science research to clients of all sizes. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the episode are solely those of the individuals involved, and Holteras Associates is not responsible for any errors or omissions, or for the results obtained from the use of this information. The information provided in this episode is for informational or educational purposes only, and is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Holteras Associates would like to say thank you to this episode's guest or guests, and thank you for listening to this episode of Holteras Presents.